Sorry.
Yeah, I thought I'd talk about, I can give you a bit about my background, but I thought I'd talk pretty generally today about music to picture and that industry. So, so yeah, as Rick said, my name's Conan Skyrme, and I run a company called Skyrmish with my brother, and we do music mainly to commercials, but we also have done film and TV work as well. And we started the company officially in 2008, so it's been going for almost 12 years. The way it came about for us was my brother was an electronic musician and I used to play in bands. And I'd scored a couple of student films and I was interested in scoring. And then I got a job at an ad agency as an in-house editor, and I got to see how internal projects you could affect the picture with music. And then I started writing my own scores and temping stuff in to play to the executive so that if we didn't have a piece of music selected. So I got a taste for it that way. And then my brother and I decided to join forces. He had already had a couple of commercials in the UK, and we formed the company and tried to use some of our ad agency contacts to launch us initially, and then from there we just kept going and met more agency people and so on. But anyway, essentially, I thought it'd be good to break down, I can tell you what I know about the business, and I know most of you are songwriters, so specifically, or all of you are songwriters, actually, because it's a songwriting workshop, but, there's three different options when you're someone making an ad, for example, or film and TV for that matter, but you can go with original underscore, which is compose music for the visuals, where you hire someone and employ them to compose music specifically for that visual content, or you can license existing hit songs, or you can license library music. And when you're licensing, we'll call it non-hit songs. Licensing library music breaks down into stock library music, which is very cheap and often sounds a little bit bad, but is a cheap option for them. And then there's kind of the between a hit artist and that's the area that I think is worthwhile focusing on for songwriters now, because if you're not a famous songwriter or a famous artist, and you're also not someone who's churning out bargain basement tracks for libraries, then you want to focus on that middle ground, because there's still some money in that area. But I'll backtrack a bit. I always think it's good to break down any part of the music business into the music part and the business part, because the business in this case, it's a social science, and then the music part is the art part, and they're two ends of a spectrum, right? It's like a magnetic pull, and anything you're doing in each area is going to be closer to one pole or the other. So your customers for music to picture are ad agencies, film production companies, and TV production companies, and anyone who's in that universe. And what they're looking for is two things. And the first thing, two functions from your music. And the first function is they're looking for a commercial function. They need to go out and sell their product, so they want to harness eyeballs, they want to get more hits online, they want to see if they can use any existing audience for something. And they do that by selecting, for say a movie, they do that by selecting a famous actor who people already know. So the film comes out and they all want to see the film because that famous actor's in it. With music you can do that. You can license a hit song and people love it already, so people will hear it's on a commercial and they'll be attracted to that commercial, so you're bringing that fan base over. And there's a few different ways you can do that. You can also, there's more subtle ways of doing that by having someone write a song that's in the style of something that's already popular. But anyway, the bottom line is the commercial function is the marketing, sales, trying to get butts and seats and eyeballs on your product thing. It's the salesy side. The second function they want from your music is what you could call the dramatic or narrative function. So that's when the purpose of that is to accent the visuals properly. So whatever the track is, if it's a song or an underscore, and you want to enhance the visuals, make them pop, maybe help explain something that's not clear in the visuals, accent something. You could even counterpoint the visuals by making it a spot that was shot straight and serious, be very comedic. So there's a dramatic function that the music's serving as well. And that's most of what you're doing. But this commercial function is key too, especially in ads. because they want to do something that's going to make people who already have an interest in something be drawn to that by using that element. So, you know, if you're not a famous artist, it really is, one thing that they do is they make you knock off a famous track, or they'll try and make you knock off a famous track, right? Which is something we stay away from, but that's one approach. So then people get excited because it's in that genre that's popular right now, and so on. So anyway, those are the two main functions of the business, and they're long-term functions that will always be there. So if you continuously write something that is appropriate for the narrative arc of a commercial or film, TV, then you'll succeed in the long term. And if you can somehow write something that gets a lot of eyeballs and attention on it, and people can do this outside of music by being social media stars or having some film composers do have a following. Hans Zimmer's kind of pretty well known. He's been associated with a lot of big films. He's a guy who had a publicist, and he does certain things, and he does live tours, and there's interviews done with him about films and so on. So you can do other things outside your music to draw attention to yourself, but I'm more concerned about working these two polar ends in a way that doesn't involve too much of the social media and extracurricular stuff. So I'm just going to look at the sheet for a sec, because I tried to get a few ideas on here and the print was a bit too small. Essentially the film and TV, obviously they focus on the dramatic arc exclusively, and commercials focus more on the commercial function, because their job, when you're making an ad, this is just breaking it down, it's pedantic, but it's worth clarifying again. When you're making an ad, you want people to buy a product, and so you're successful if they've gone out and then bought the product you're advertising, in theory. And then if you're making a film, the film and TV show is the content, so if people find it entertaining, then you've sold that particular product. So there's a subtle difference between the two. Both need visually to work, but one, the commercial world, you need to then go and give people the impetus to go and buy a product. And so in theory, those are your two goals. They'll always be the long-term goals. In practice, the tough thing about that both businesses is there's conflict. The two things are intertwined sometimes. And I'll just there are a couple of examples anyway. These. Okay, here's sorry. This writing is microscopic. Okay, so for example, in a commercial, usually you think you want to get people excited about the product. So there's an example on, a friend of mine used to work in strategy, and there's a brand in the UK of French fries, oven French fries, and the client would always come into the ad agency and say, hey, what about some peppy music? And then someone biting into the French fry and saying, yum. And then that's, get the close-up of the product, the name, and then someone looking like they're having a great time eating a French fries. And then the agency, this is an example of human behavior creeping in and different incentives. The agency then go and say, what about if we shoot this extremely artistic commercial that's going to win us an award at one of the big ad agency things, and we don't show the French fries at all or the product, and instead we have this very artistic mini film that's 60 seconds, and it's dramatic, and it's scored with an orchestra, and it's interesting, and then the client say, what about you just have the French fry and the product? And they say, no, trust us, this is going to be great. As the composer on that, you're given this thing that they've shot that's very artistic and interesting, doesn't really hype the product too much, and they want an alternate choice of music, and you've got to be aware, okay, the agency's winning here in terms of decision making. They want to make something that's purely creative, so give them something interesting, run wild, use an orchestra, whatever you want, whatever they've asked you to do. Don't worry too much about keeping it peppy and trying to sell French fries, because they've already primed their client that they're not going to get that. So in the back of your mind, you're always aware who's winning the power struggle in terms of the two ends of the spectrum. And sometimes ad agencies, although they're judged by how much product their client is selling since they've become the agency, things are so short term now that ad agencies used to sign long agency of record deals with with their clients, where they'd be their agency for 4 years, 8 years, a decade, whatever. Now they don't. So sometimes they're just project to project. So they're going to try and get what they can out of the arrangement as well, especially if they do it at a reasonable price for the client. So it's all these things that give you your professional skills that help you try and assess what's really going on in a spot. You figure out what you're really doing in that moment. And these are all short-term factors, but you've got to be aware of them. The other thing is producers sometimes, especially on commercials, say they want something unique, and so the words you'll get thrown at you as a composer will be, we need something very specific. These are worst case scenarios, by the way. I'm not trying to badmouth the industry as a whole, but these are the things that come up. And they'll say, we want something really unique, we're trying to do something really interesting, and then ultimately they're too nervous to follow through on that when you give them something unique and interesting, so you have to fall back on tropes and genre specific things. And this has happened a lot of times to us, where you know, they'll want you to fuse 3 different genres together, or what if we had no music and just this sound effect that, and then you give it to them and they think, that's not a commercial, that doesn't sound like anything I've heard before, because it's new. So be aware always if you're ever in a situation to pitch your music for something, when someone's asking for something really out there, if you have the chance to write something, find out if they really want that, or if you think it. That's why it's always safe to send them batches of tracks, because some people really are adventurous and pioneering. Most people get scared at the end because they've got a client relationship to preserve, and the clients are ultimately trying to sell French fries to people, and they don't want to do anything too crazy. So there's another little wild card that gets thrown your way, is the taste of the people involved in the decision-making process. So these are just a quick short list of things to bear in mind, but these are the things that actually practically happen, despite the ideal that you're supposed to be aiming for. So taste. This is an obvious one, but there's people who have a very peculiar leaning towards a genre, and they might be senior in the decision chain. And if you want to find out who's really at the top, usually just follow the money up until you get to the client who's spending the money. Often it stops at the agency level because they've protected their relationship with the client, and they're ultimately, you know, the chief creative officer at the ad agency will be making the decisions. But you never really know. Directors sometimes have say, but anyway, if someone has a particular leaning, it might start coming to the surface as you're working. They say, we want something contemporary and fresh, and then it turns out they only like music from the mid-50s or whatever it might be, and you think, their idea of contemporary and fresh, you know, you got to always try and gauge it's not always how old someone is, but it's also just that they might have a peculiar genre interest. You know, chief creative officers that I know pride themselves on being knowledgeable about all sorts of music, but they come back to the same genre repeatedly. Singer-songwriter genre, there's I know, I won't name names, but there's an agency that handles a lot of car commercials, and someone senior there really loves singer-songwriters. They love a male voice with a guitar, and whatever you've presented to them before, whatever the project is, they'll find a way to try and railroad it back into that pocket, which is great if that's what you do. But you know, you build relationships and get to know these things as well. So you don't send him stuff that's going to waste time knocking around with junior creatives and only to end up on his desk and he goes, nope, and then just grabs the other stuff. So the other thing is politics. I've worked on films where there's been a director and a producer. There's so many permutations. It's like any job, I guess, but the director usually is in charge when you're working on a film. It's his vision, and you're trying to tailor your music to his vision. You know, the writer's had his say and built the story arcs. The director comes in, shoots the thing, and executes it. So he should know the story arcs and preserve those. And people lose objectivity a bit, but generally it's good to have one point of contact. I worked on a film where the director and the producer seemed as though they were on the same page. The producer's the guy who's paying for the thing. And they used to come in together when we'd have our meetings, and I'd play them cues and they'd approve them. But it got to the point where the director and the producer started disagreeing, so they started booking separate appointments with me. So they'd come in and I'd play a cue to one of them, the director, and he would say, yeah, that's great, yeah, signed off. And then I would get a call from the producer the next day. He would come over and go, this is all wrong. It should sound like, anyway, I can't, I don't want to get too specific. But, you know, dealing with that as a composer is tough, because you then have to be political because there's a power struggle going on again, and you have to figure out who's my boss. Ultimately, which one of these people, if I just listen to them, is going to be the one that makes me stay on the project, and how can I fuse their two ideas together? So you're given a pretty tough task because you're at the end of the chain, and if there's disagreements, you have to try and figure them out. So you're like a psychotherapist as well as a composer. So anyway, that's one other thing. A couple more on the checklist here. Time frames. People often don't want to get locked into their ideas, even creatives. So they'll push the shoot back, they'll keep changing things, then it gets to the edit phase, and the edit will keep changing because they're not happy and they're afraid the client's not going to like it, so they push, but there's a hard date for shipping the spot or the film, and you're at the end of the line. So they can bring you on 3 months before the shoot and talk about, oh, we'd love it to sound like Rachmaninoff. When it gets into it, what they've shot is often very different from the concept, and then what they've shot changes a lot in the edit, and then keeps changing as they totally redefine what the spot's about. They start panicking and second guessing what the client's doing, and you end up with 2 days to try and put something to what they end up with, which they're still insecure about. So the edit's changing under your feet while you're. So the to picture process is fraught with difficulty like this. I'll give you 2 more examples, then I'll move on to the mechanics of scoring. So temp love, which some of you may have heard of, is they put temp music on most of these things, temporary placeholder tracks, and you're often given them as a reference or a starting point. And most enlightened creative professionals, directors, producers, ad executives, use that as a jumping off point. They say, broadly, we want it to be happy. We put that in there as a placeholder. Obviously, don't copy it. And then you go on about your business. But it turns out some of them don't want you to copy it, but have gotten so used to the temp that anything that's even remotely different from it in any part, they say, well, what have you done? And you say, well, I'm giving you something. And there may even be a section of the temp that doesn't work at all. It may be tonally right, but they've heard it so many times. There could be a section where it doesn't even match the visuals. And you say, well, I tried to take on board your notes as a tone, and I changed it so that it hit this cut here, because you said you wanted to accent the guy jumping off the building or whatever it is. And then they'll say, no, you remember the track we sent you? And it turns out they've locked in, and there's been a consensus that is built by this thing playing again and again in test screenings and between themselves. And so that's something you have to try and convince them by coming up with different solutions. Temp love is a really tricky one, because that's a problem. There's some people who get locked in on it and always say they're open to ideas, but they're not. And you only know that by working with them. And then you have to figure out how to not copy a temp track, which is mostly what happens in the film world, especially now. That's why most scores you'll hear nowadays, a lot of them anyway, sound like a knockoff of a knockoff of a knockoff of a Hans Zimmer score from 1996 or whatever it is. You can follow the chain, but it's kind of interesting. It's a slightly depressing, monochromatic world that we live in for that reason. But if you're good enough to manipulate human relationships with these people and to write good enough exciting music as an alternative, you can break through that. But it takes 10 times the amount of work than if they were a blank slate to start with. Okay, last one. No, that was the last one. There we go. All right. So that aside, we can move on to the music side, since we've addressed some of the problems and issues and things to be prepared for on the business side. So the music side, the way it works, or the way it used to work in the golden era with film, was you'd demo an idea while they were in production, and you'd come up with a theme or two, and then you'd play it to the director and the producer, and they'd say, no, yes, that sounds great, I see that for this character. So that's still the way it works now, often with film. You come up with a theme for a main character or a situation, or the theme for the movie, and that's the first time you'll be interacting with them. And you're sending them stuff, and they may be finishing up production, they may have not started production yet, they may just be beginning the edit, any phase. And you're trying to give them something that they think works for their film. And so there's a trial and error process there. When they've agreed on the themes, as the cut comes together, you meet with them and have what's called a spotting session, where you sit and you watch the whole cut, which is hopefully as finalized as possible, with the director, and you go through together and say, I think there should be music here, and he says, no, I think we should have it, this character does something here, we should definitely have a musical accent here, or I'm a bit insecure about this scene, it doesn't have enough energy, could we put something in this? There's all sorts of reasons for the music to be there. You go through and block it out, and you have your timings, and then you go back to your studio and you start, you essentially start composing each cue. and they've given you a copy of the cut, so you can see it and you work one cue at a time. Then with your timing notes and your cues being composed, if there's going to be a live session, you orchestrate it. This is probably all common knowledge to every one of you, but I'll just go through the steps here. Then you orchestrate it, you prepare the parts, then you have a recording session, you put it in front of the musicians, then you edit the music, mix it, you're done. You send it to the dub mix to be mixed. Now that applies particularly for film, and you still have music editors in films often who will help you after even the cues have been recorded, because nowadays the edits still change. They'll help you finesse the recorded material, because you don't want to go back in, especially with a big orchestra, and re-record stuff when the edit changes. So they will be experts at pulling out stems and trimming things to fit any differences in the cut. Sometimes you have to scrap entire cues and you have to figure something else out, but generally the process will be laid out for you this way. You'll go in, you'll meet with them, come up with themes, you get your timing notes, do the spotting session, all the rest of it. With commercials, the time frames are usually much quicker. It's a shorter thing, doing a 60-second commercial, but you're essentially going through these processes. They say, send us a bunch of tracks. We think here's a temp track on here that we think kind of works. Can you give us some options that might be in the zone? So you have to have a bunch of spaghetti to already throw at the wall. So if you guys have pre-recorded tracks in your arsenal, and especially instrumental stuff that you think is along the lines of what they want, send them 5 to 10 tracks. They look at them, and then it's often their editor. The editors hold the key. I don't know, Rick said his son might be getting into this business too. They're the ones who have taken away a lot of the responsibility from the composers, which might be a good thing for us given the level of indecision that goes on in the business. But they're sitting with the picture and cutting it in. So the creative might say, I kind of like these 3 tracks. So the editor will go and line up and say, I think this is working, and might have some influence. So then you get word back from the editor and the director, and a certain track they've picked will be cut into it, and then you might have to revise it and tweak it to picture. So if you have tracks and you have songs or instrumentals, whatever they might be, if you want to be involved in a higher volume of projects, if you have the skills and you're able to use a DAW, any workstation or Pro Tools or whatever, and you stem your stuff out, it's professionally prepared, and someone gives you a cut and you can rework your own track to the cut fairly quickly and efficiently without making it sound weird, that's going to probably increase the number of jobs you'll be exposed to. I know as someone running an ad music company, we have freelancers, and if their production level is high, so they can do everything in the computer themselves, and they can do it quickly, and they know how to manipulate to picture, they've practiced, and they know there's a hard cut here, I feel like you've got to have some sustain in the bass, but we need to pull out the drums here. There's all sorts of weird creative solutions when you're trying to rejig a track that work. If they're quick and they come up with decent solutions, then you're always going to want to go back to those people. So I guess I want to stress the nuts and bolts of working with your stems. You can record stuff live months ahead of whenever you'd pitch it for something, but if you have the stems, and if you even might need to do something cosmetic, you have a batch of sample libraries that you can use, where if someone said, I don't like the lead guitar line, I want something else, can you put in, can we have like a cello solo, because I feel like it's an emotional scene. You can quickly pull up a cello sample and add it onto your existing track, whatever it is. You just need to be flexible, because they don't give you time and they don't care, and there's a million other tracks they've got, because there's 1,000 libraries that all sound great, and by libraries I mean actual music library services. That there's APM and all these other library services where you can pay $50 for a track from the 70s or 60s that sounds incredible, and if they're looking for a period piece and we're trying to recreate it at several grand for the spot, and they can get something for $50 that was recorded in that era, you've got your work cut out for you. You have to be really, really good and really quick, and you have to know how to isolate genres and get into them really quickly. Anyway, I'll leave you with this. I found a book. It seems like it's a modern problem because timelines have gotten shorter and shorter, that we're having a tough time these days because the technology means that 1 million people with a laptop can be competing against you. You know, the supply has gone through the roof, so prices drop. It's, you know, the old supply and demand curve. So we're in a tough spot. And then I found this book up in Solvang that was written in 1937 about the golden era of Filmmaking by Nancy Naumburg, and it had a section. It had a section for each process of filmmaking from the 30s, and they had an interview with like a famous director. I think it was Vincent Minnelli was the director, and then they had a famous editor of the time, famous studio producer, and they had one. Max Steiner was a film composer in the 30s who did King Kong and a bunch of other stuff, and they had a section where he was interviewed. One of the first things written was him complaining that editing often gets held up, squeezing the music department, so they've got a race to meet the booking date, going without sleep for 52 hours straight sometimes and taking Benzedrine to stay awake. So those guys would sometimes have to write these orchestral scores in several days, because the editing they kept doing test screenings. They weren't happy, but they booked the film to start playing in theaters, and they had a premiere date. So nothing's really changed. I don't know if this is encouraging or not. And then he also complained that test screenings sometimes spur producers to rejig the film, cutting big chunks of music, sometimes requiring additional music to cover up what were perceived as weak scenes that they've realized at the very end of the process. So, music's the Band-Aid, the Hail Mary, and the whipping boy at the end of the process. And if you're prepared for that, and you can be nimble and adjust, then you can have all these tracks that you've already created lovingly months before, and you can do these last-minute tweaks, and you'll be in the right zone. So I'll just say just a couple of things. To meet this challenge, you just have to be flexible, and you have to be enjoy being a problem solver. You have to be also detached enough to have enough equanimity to prevent the delicate creative part of your brain from being damaged by all this insanity and people being blunt and saying that's not right, it's not right for the scene. People will say things that are not a judgment of your music but seem that way constantly, because everything's valid. But in this process, you have to basically give a director what he wants, or give the producer what he wants, even if it's totally irrational. That's part of your job. You have to always try and reach that long-term goal of having it being dramatically appropriate there, because otherwise your career will suffer. So you're balancing the short and the long term. Last two things I'll say is to preserve your value as composers too, if you are entering this field. There's 4 criteria, and I always like to say try and get 2 out of these 4 before you say yes to a job, because otherwise you'll probably hurt yourself, you might not be able to deliver, you might hurt your reputation. So the 4 things are money, credit, relationship, creative fulfillment. If you get 2 of those 4, take the job. If you don't, if you only get 1 of the 4, I'd seriously question whether it's worth getting involved. And very lastly, there's the old fast, cheap, and good triangle, and you're supposed to only give them 2 out of 3. If they try and make you give them something that's fast, cheap, and good at the same time, I think you should charge them more, so it'll make it expensive. You know what I mean? Like every corner of the triangle has to be adjusted. But never make music that's not good. And in general, I find something that helps give you confidence and be able to deal with equanimity in all these situations where people are throwing these seemingly inane challenges at you that are not helping, is if you constantly develop your songwriting craft, your music chops, if you can learn how to write and read music, write things down, create your own lead sheets. They're always required at the end of a job if you've made a song for a commercial, which some of what we do is songwriting for commercials, making a jingle. They'll often give you the lyrics, but you have to write the music, and then at the end they need a lead sheet because they often buy it out from you, so they have to own it, so you have to prepare the lead sheet. So in small ways, it's nice for me to sit down and still be able to write music, and getting better at your instruments, practicing. All that stuff gives you just an innate confidence, so you can weather the storm of all this kind of insane side of the business. But I would recommend it. I think as songwriters, they're using a lot of songs in commercials. And yeah, if you guys have any questions about the process, I thought that would maybe just give you a bit of an overview, and I hope it wasn't negative or too irrelevant to you as songwriters. But that's what we do. And if anyone has any questions.
Can you just go over the 4 steps again?
Oh, sure. The four criteria for taking a job.
Yeah.
Sure.
I knew I had one.
Oh yeah. So, if the money's good, the credit's good, like you're getting a good credit to help your resume. The relationship is good. You're forming a relationship with someone who you know is productive and is going to go on to more things that will bring you along. If there's creative fulfillment, if you're doing something where you're expressing yourself and showing the world what you can do. if you can get 2 of those 4, I think it's worth it. I mean, you can get 1 of those 4, and I've taken lots of things that had none of those 4, and I didn't realize that until after I started. But as long as you stick to your obligations and you write the best music you can, I think you can go pretty far. It's fairly democratic. I mean, it's fairly egalitarian in terms of if you're good, people will use you, and that's what I like about this town and the business. It's just, if you're good, it means you have to be someone who's good at stomaching all the other and navigating all the other short-term issues. Yes? Oh, sorry.
So, what are the avenues to get existing songs as a songwriter into commercials? Like, since you worked in an ad agency, where do they look for these songs, and what makes them say, I want your song in my commercial?
That's a great question. Generally, the process is, so at an ad agency you have, there's a broadcast, it used to be there was a broadcast department who handled all the TV and radio ads, and they're the juicy, big projects that you want because they pay the most still. There's web ads now are most of what most ad agencies are doing, and the big ad agencies have often fractured into lots of little small digital agencies. So, but the process generally was, in the broadcast department you had producers who worked there and ran the production of the spots, and they're the guys who hire you. But what they do is they probably don't usually directly hire songwriters. Sometimes they do. They usually go to a music company like mine or a library service, and they ask us to try some things against picture, or sometimes there's a demo fee involved for the people, our freelancers, which we pass on to them, where they say, try a few things to picture, and then they pick the one they like. Usually they triple bid if it's a formal job, but they have to get it out to 3 different music companies. Sometimes they go direct to the publisher or a record label if a creative, so the creatives write the ad, and sometimes the producers like to respect their opinion. If the creative is senior enough and has a strong opinion, says, this is the way I wrote this ad and I feel like this track is perfect. Or sometimes there's a track written in as part of the ad, like we did a commercial for Adidas where they wanted a Sesame Street song, so we had to rework that, so they paid us to re-record a Sesame Street song, but that's what they wanted. That was part of the whole concept of the ad. So I'm rambling a bit, but there's so many different ways that it's teed up, but often they'll go direct to a publisher or a label if it's an existing famous song, or they'll come to a company like ours and they'll say, we want to try a few things, this is the kind of genre, could you demo, and then we'll agree a demo rate, or a kill fee if they hire us, and then we'll get our team on it, or if we feel like we're not capable, we'll bring in some extra freelancers who have a specialty in another area. So if you're a songwriter, you can put your music with certain libraries, and there's higher level, there's stock libraries which have very cheap options, and then there's places like, I think Killer Tracks might be one. I'm not extremely familiar. We have our own library because that's the way things work now, but Killer Tracks and Mega Tracks might have slightly higher priced and better music in general, where sometimes they'll record an orchestra or have pretty legit indie singer-songwriters come along. We had a record label for a while for that reason, is that for licensing songs we wanted to have a roster of our own talent, and we ran that for 2 or 3 years, but it's that running a record label is a whole separate job in itself, so that became quite difficult. But yeah, as a songwriter, you should approach music supervisors, companies like mine. You should try and get signed to a publisher if you're not someone who wants to publish your own stuff and mercilessly self-promote it all the time and make sure it's being tracked all around the world and all that. That's tough. But those are the three main paths, I'd say.
So if we were contacting a company like yours,
yeah.
What do you take unsolicited music to look at to see if it works or anything, or how does it work?
Yeah, we do. Usually not entirely unsolicited. Like I usually don't take entirely unsolicited stuff because you want to know who's on the other end. If I get an email from the Ukraine from someone saying, "Hey, check out my cool tracks," and then you go, "Okay, it could be a virus. It could also be that guy doesn't own those tracks." You need to have someone like, the fact I'm here and Rick knows you guys means that I'm more inclined to listen to your tracks, because I feel like you're most likely going to be people that have been somewhat vetted by Rick. But you really got to find out, our worries, someone like me, is the intellectual property owned by these people, or are they liars who've gone around selling other people's tracks as their own? And then we get it in a spot, it goes to commercial, and then surprise, it was actually signed to another publisher, and there's 3 other writers on it, and now that's the worst situation we can be in, is looking bad with our ad agency clients. So, or looking like we haven't got our business organized. So really, if you can form relationships with anyone in the business, music supervisors are great, but they're very busy. So if there's a particular songwriter who has something that really stands out, and it's often the voice, you know, it's always the voice. If you have a great voice and you're doing your own demos and your songs are strong enough, maybe a music supervisor will take your card and keep all your stuff in there. They'll take a lot of stuff. I can give you some music supervisor names, but I'm not sure. I don't have their email, or I do have their emails, but I don't have them on me, and there's just a few. They're usually small operations.
But you got to know what they're working on, right? You
got to know. You'll never really know what they're working on because they work on so many things. They often, and there's not too many of them now. The big ones. I'm totally drawing a blank on the 3 big ones, but we've dealt with them a few times, and they have usually a team of 5 or 6 music supervisors under one company roof, and they'll work on a bunch of the TV shows. Like if you watch TV shows and films, you'll often see the same names listed under music supervisor. There's only probably 15 ones that are doing all the work. It's become that way in a lot of areas, where the same 15 people show up on everything because they have teams now, and so their name shows up, and then they got the same 5 people. Even in music, there's the top 15 composers, 20, 25 composers get all the jobs, and they don't always even compose them themselves. They have a team. And so it's become this aggregation thing where the lone composer isn't, people don't really even
a sweatshop.
Say that again. Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's just a different model.
Terminology a lot, and especially in the music.
Yeah, it's true. I mean,
music scoring.
It's you know, it is what it is. It's become harder because the studios are making fewer movies. The budgets are smaller, except in like a handful of cases with big superhero films. And so for the big budget stuff, their deadlines are so impossible that you need a team anyway. So a guy at the top becomes the name guy, and then he farms the work out to the guys below, and he keeps the money. Not all of it, but you know,
most of it.
It's like become a branding. Yes.
When you do stems, do you do them raw or do you do them with the effects added to them?
Both. We usually ask what's required. I tend to stem. If we don't know, we'll stem out everything. We'll stem out effects separately. But yeah, with commercials, the stems you don't need. They usually don't change that much, so it depends how insecure they are on the project. But we'll just wing it. We'll see what's going on and say, this is a pretty cut and dried ad. I'll give them 4, 8 stems, and I'll keep the effects on. It's best if you're pretty confident about it to leave it the way you want it. Don't give them too many options. Also, they get confused if you give them, you know, there's some dub mixer there going, oh, and then if he mutes a stem by accident or something, you give them, more things can go wrong. So I try and just give them the mix in some cases, and then even give them the stem. I have them ready to go just in case in an email.
What's a stem?
Stems are individual. If you have a track, it's each instrument separately bounced, so that you have